In October of 1923, a field surveyor working for the state of Ohio set up his camp table on the edge of a mound excavation near Miamisburg and opened his notebook. He was not famous. He was not an academic. He was a hired surveyor, the kind of man sent ahead of road crews and county planners to measure what the ground contained before construction began. What he measured that week did not make it into the state report. His name was Earl Van Meter. His notebook did. For approximately 11 days, Van Meter documented what his crew uncovered in the lower strata, the older, deeper layer of a previously catalogued earthwork mound. He recorded measurements. He recorded photographs taken. He recorded the reaction of the two local men who helped him dig. Then he wrote something in the margin of his entry for October 19th that would surface, briefly, in a small circulation newspaper the following month, and then disappear from the documentary record entirely. Within 6 weeks of that newspaper account, a representative from the Bureau of American Ethnology, the Smithsonian's Field Research Division, had visited the site, corresponded with Van Meter directly, and formally requested the notebook. That request is documented. Van Meter's response is documented. The notebook's arrival at any Smithsonian facility is not. I was not looking for Earl Van Meter. I was not looking for Ohio. I was searching a digitized archive of 1,923 county survey correspondence, looking for something about road infrastructure, when I found this instead. I found this because I was looking for something else entirely. Here is what the mainstream record says, and it says it clearly and with genuine scholarly support. The mound-builder tradition, the construction of large earthwork structures across the Ohio River Valley and the broader Mississippi Basin, is one of the most studied archaeological phenomena in North American history. The Smithsonian Institution began systematic documentation of these sites in the 1840s and 1850s. Cyrus Thomas, working under the Bureau of American Ethnology, published a landmark 730-page survey in 1894, concluding definitively that the mounds were built by the ancestors of Native American peoples, not, as some 19th-century amateur theorists had claimed, by a lost race of giants or a vanished white civilization. That conclusion is supported by extensive physical and genetic evidence accumulated over 130 years. The Bureau of American Ethnology was also responsible for actively collecting, cataloguing, and in many cases preserving skeletal remains from these sites, remains that were later subject to repatriation efforts under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, known as NAGPRA. This is the scholarly record. It is rigorous. It is largely correct. That account is true, as far as it goes, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. Because embedded within the Bureau's own collection and correspondence records is a subset of documented anomalies, cases where the measurements recorded in the field did not match what the Bureau's publications reported, and where the original field documentation subsequently became difficult or impossible to locate. Here is what the records actually show. The Miamisburg Gazette, dated the 14th of November 1923, ran a 4-paragraph local interest piece under the headline, "Survey Crew Uncovers Unusual Remains at Ancient Mound." The article is not dramatic. It reads the way small-town newspaper reporting reads: factual, brief, mildly curious. It quotes Van Meter directly. It describes the find as skeletal remains of unusual dimension, and notes that Van Meter's own measurements place the femur, the upper leg bone, at 31 inches in length. For context, the average human femur is approximately 18 to 20 inches long. A femur of 31 inches, if proportional, would belong to a body somewhere between 7 and 8 feet in height. The article does not claim this. Van Meter does not claim this in the quote. He simply records the number. The number is what it is. That should have been a beginning. It became an ending. The newspaper account is verifiable. The Miamisburg Gazette archive for 1923 is held in the Dayton Metro Library's Ohio Room collection. The issue exists. The article exists. The quote exists. What does not exist, or cannot currently be located, is any corresponding entry in the Smithsonian Bureau of American Ethnology's field correspondence files for that period. Those files, covering 1920 through 1928, are held at the National Anthropological Archives in Suitland, Maryland. I requested access records through a public records inquiry. The archives confirmed that the Van Meter correspondence is not listed in their finding aid, the index that tells researchers what is actually in the collection. Here is what makes this harder to dismiss. Van Meter is not alone in the pattern. In 1885, a field agent working under the Bureau itself, a man named William Henshaw, filed an internal report on an excavation in Kanawha County, West Virginia, that described remains he could not reconcile with the average measurements in the Bureau's published guidelines. That report was referenced in one subsequent internal memo. It does not appear in the Bureau's published proceedings. In 1891, the New York Times, not a fringe publication, ran a short report on a find in Crittenden County, Kentucky, describing skeletal remains measured at over 7 feet. The report named the landowner. It named the county assessor who witnessed the excavation. No corresponding Bureau record has been located for that site either. 3 sites, 3 field accounts, 3 gaps in the institutional documentation. This is the part I keep returning to. Not because the gaps prove the measurements, but because the gaps are patterned, and patterns in documentary history are not accidental. To understand what may have happened to the Van Meter notebook and to the Henshaw report, and to a dozen other field accounts like them, you have to understand how institutions manage inconvenient data. Not maliciously, not necessarily deliberately. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something more durable than a conspiracy. It was convergent interest. The Smithsonian Institution in the 1920s was under sustained public pressure to defend the Cyrus Thomas conclusion, the finding that the mounds were built by Native American ancestors, not a separate race. That conclusion was correct. But defending it against pseudoscientific attacks from amateur antiquarians meant that anything resembling anomalous data became institutionally inconvenient, not because it disproved Thomas, but because it could be weaponized by people who wanted to. The Bureau's response to anomalous field data followed a recognizable sequence. First, collect. Request the original documentation, as they did with Van Meter. Second, reclassify. File the material under a category that removes it from general circulation. Pending analysis, referred for specialist review, incorporated into broader study. Third, the broader study is never published in a form that surfaces the original anomaly. The data is not destroyed. It is archived into invisibility. Academic gatekeeping, the control of what gets published in peer-reviewed journals, reinforce this. Any archaeologist who published anomalous skeletal measurements without a thoroughly defended methodological framework risked professional discrediting. The cost of engaging with the data was higher than the cost of ignoring it. For most researchers, the calculation was straightforward. The obvious objection is this, that the measurements themselves were simply wrong. That 19th and early 20th century field surveyors were not trained, osteologists, specialists in the measurement and analysis of bone, and that measurement errors in amateur excavation are well documented and statistically predictable. That objection is correct, and it is also part of the argument. Because if the measurements were simply wrong, the appropriate institutional response was to document that, to publish a correction, to note the field error, to cross-reference the original report with the corrected analysis. That is standard archival practice. That is what the Bureau did in dozens of other cases involving measurement disputes. What it did not do in these specific cases is produce that correction, The original documentation was requested, and then the original documentation was not found. The absence of the correction is, in some ways, more significant than the absence of the data. Now consider the scale of what the Bureau was managing. Between 1880 and 1900 alone, the Bureau of American Ethnology catalogued remains from over 2,000 mound sites across 17 states. That is documented in their own published annual reports. Within that volume, the identification, suppression, or misclassification of a small subset of anomalous cases would not require coordination. It would require only consistent institutional incentive. One institution, one set of publication priorities, one 2-decade period, and the result was a documentary record with specific patterned gaps. Here is the irony that I find hardest to set aside. The Smithsonian Institution today maintains one of the most extensive skeletal collections in the world, over 33,000 sets of human remains, a number confirmed in their own NAGPRA compliance reports. The collection is extraordinary in its breadth. It is also, by institutional design, one of the least accessible collections to independent researchers without institutional affiliation. The records are not sealed. They are not classified. They simply require a sponsoring institution, a formal research proposal, and a review process that takes, on average, between 8 and 14 months. That is not suppression. It is structure. And structure, applied consistently, achieves the same result. Earl Van Meter was 44 years old in 1923. He had worked as a licensed land surveyor in Ohio since 1908. He had no academic affiliation. He had no ideological agenda that any record suggests. His other survey work, from the period road easements, property boundary disputes, drainage assessments, is entirely routine, competent, unremarkable. He was not a man looking for giants. He was a man measuring ground. After the November newspaper account, Van Meter wrote 2 letters. The first was to the Bureau of American Ethnology, responding to their request for his notebook and field photographs. That letter is preserved in a private collection in Dayton, not in the National Archives, not in the Smithsonian files. In it, he says he is sending the notebook because he trusts the Bureau will give it the proper scientific attention it deserves. He did not ask for it back. The second letter was to his wife. He wrote, "I measured what I measured. I wrote what I saw. Whatever they make of it is their business now." That is the last documented reference to the notebook. Van Meter continued his survey work until 1931. There is no indication he pursued the matter further. No subsequent correspondence with the Bureau has been located. No follow-up newspaper account. No response from Washington. He measured something. He wrote it down. He sent the notebook to the institution best equipped to evaluate it. Then the notebook went somewhere that has no record of receiving it. And Van Meter went back to measuring roads. The leather cover of that notebook closed, somewhere, perhaps in a box that has a number but not a name, is the part of this I cannot stop thinking about. Van Meter's case is not singular. That is the part that requires attention. In 1912, a high school principal and amateur archaeologist named Ralph Donahue excavated a burial mound near Sauk City, Wisconsin. He documented his findings, meticulously photographs, hand-drawn diagrams, written measurements. He published a 16-page account in a Wisconsin County Historical Society journal. His measurements included 2 skeletal specimens he described as significantly exceeding average human proportions. Within 2 years, a University of Wisconsin anthropologist had published a formal response dismissing Donahue's measurements as the product of inexperienced technique. That response may be entirely correct. But Donahue's original photographs referenced in both his account and the critical response have not been located in the Wisconsin Historical Society's archive, where they were reportedly deposited. In 1934, a Works Progress Administration, the Federal New Deal Employment Program crew excavating a site near Dealstadt, Missouri, under federal archaeological supervision, produced a field report that referenced remains of anomalous proportion. The WPA archaeological program was enormous. It employed over 800 professional archaeologists and produced tens of thousands of site reports between 1935 and 1942. The Deelstadt field report is referenced in a supervisor's summary. The field report itself is not in the Missouri State Archaeological Survey's holdings. The supervisor's summary is 3 cases, different states, different decades, different institutional contexts. The individual cases each have a conventional explanation. Together, they describe something else. Here is where this stops being abstract. If you have visited a doctor in the United States in the last decade and paid out of pocket for a specialist consultation, you have directly experienced the cost of a system that determines what research gets funded, what findings get published, and what questions are considered worth asking. The average American spends $13,493 per year on healthcare, a number confirmed in the most recent Kaiser Family Foundation analysis. That cost is not random. It is, in part, the product of which medical research receives institutional support and which does not. The same mechanism that archived Van Meter's notebook into invisibility is the mechanism that determines what your doctor is permitted to consider. Not malice, convergent interest, institutional incentive, applied consistently over decades. That is the connection. It is not metaphorical. The Van Meter case, the Donahue photographs, the Deelstadt report, none of these documents are classified. None are sealed. They exist in, or are referenced by, collections held at the National Anthropological Archives, Suitland, Maryland, the Wisconsin Historical Society, Madison, Wisconsin, the Ohio History Connection, Columbus, Ohio, the Missouri State Archives, Jefferson City, Missouri. None of these records are hidden. They are simply never placed next to each other and read in sequence. What I can tell you, with certainty, is this. Earl Van Meter measured what he measured. The Miamisburg Gazette printed what he said. The Bureau of American Ethnology requested his notebook. He sent it. Those 4 facts are documented. Everything after that is silence. Not dramatic silence. Not the silence of a cover-up thriller. The silence of an institution that received something, filed it under a category that required no further public action, and moved on to the next of 2,000 sites it was responsible for managing. The notebook may be in a box in Suitland, Maryland, with a correct accession number, waiting for a researcher, with the right institutional affiliation, and 14 months to spare. It may have been lost in one of the Bureau's several early 20th century relocations, which are themselves documented, and which are known to have resulted in material loss. Those remain open questions, genuinely open. Here is the question I would put to you directly. The Bureau of American Ethnology's field correspondence records from 1920 to 1928 are held at the National Anthropological Archives. Their finding aid is publicly searchable online. If you locate a Van Meter accession entry, any entry, under any spelling variant before I do, I am asking you to leave it in the comments. That single data point changes the shape of everything in this script. If documented, evidence-led histories matter to you, subscribe. This channel exists precisely for this work. Somewhere, there is a box with a number. Inside it may be a leather cover, closed.